Scene 3. I is in a semi-narcotized state on the bed in Jane's room. Jane is in the hall burdened with paper sacks of groceries. The writer appears behind her. Jane, brightly. Good morning. Writer, shyly. Oh, good morning. Jane. Such a difficult operation, opening a purse with one hand. Writer. Let me hold the sacks for you. Jane. Oh, thanks. Now then, come in, put the sacks on one of those chairs. Over the weekend, we run out of everything. Ice isn't delivered on Sundays. Milk spoils. Everything of a perishable kind has got to be replaced. Oh, don't go out. Have you had a coffee? Ryder, looking at Ty. I was about to, but... Jane. Stay and have some with me. Sorry it's instant. Can you stand instant coffee? Ryder. I beg your pardon? Jane. Don't mind him. When his eyes are half open, it doesn't mean he is conscious. Ty. Bullshit. You picked up a kid on the street? Jane, suppressing anger. This is the young man from across the hall. I'm Jane Sparks. My friend is Ty McCool, and you are? Writer, pretending to observe a chessboard to cover his embarrassment. What a beautiful chessboard! Jane. Oh, that, yes. Writer, ivory and ebony figures? Jane. The white squares are mother of pearl. Do you play chess? Writer, used to. You play together, you and Mr. McCool? Ty. Yeah, we play together, but not chess. He rubs his crotch. Jane and the writer nervously study the chessboard. Jane. I play alone. A solitary game to keep in practice in case I meet a partner. Writer. Look, black is in check. Jane. My imaginary opponent. I choose sides, you see, although I play for both. Writer. I'd be happy to. I mean, sometimes when you... Ty, touching the saucepan on the burner. Ow! Jane. I set it to boil before I went to the store. Jane sets a cup and donuts on the table. Ty. Hey, kid, why don't you take your cup across the hall to your own room? Jane. Because I've just now, you heard me, invited him to have it in here in this room with me. Ty. I didn't invite him in, and I want you to get something straight. I live here, and if I live in a place, I got equal rights in this place, and it just so happens I don't entertain no stranger to look at me undressed. Writer, gulping down his coffee. Please, I think I'd rather go in my room because I've got some work to do there. I always work immediately after my coffee. Jane. I will not have this young grifter who has established squatters' rights here telling me that I can't enjoy a little society in a place where, frankly, I'm frantic with loneliness. The writer does not know what to do. Ty suddenly grins. He pulls out a chair for the writer at the table as if it were for a lady. Ty. Have a seat, kid. You'll like one lump or two. Where's the cat? Can I invite the goddamn cat to breakfast? Jane. Ty, you said you were pleased with the robe I gave you for your birthday, but you never wear it. Ty. I don't dress for breakfast. Jane. Putting on a silk robe isn't dressing. She removes the robe from a hook and throws it about Ty's shoulders. Automatically, he circles her hips with an arm. Ty. Good. Feels good. Jane, shyly disengaging herself from his embrace. It ought to. Shantung silk. Ty. I didn't mean the robe, babe. Jane. Ty, behave yourself. She turns to the writer. I've cherished the hope that by introducing Ty to certain little improvements in wearing apparel and the language, I may gradually, despite his resistance. Ty. Ain't that lovely? That classy language she uses? Jane. Inspire him to seek out some higher level of employment. Ignoring Ty, she speaks. I heard that you were a writer. Writer. I write, but... Jane. What form of writing? I mean, fiction or poetry or faggots. They all do something artistic, all of them. Jane, quickly. Do you know, I find myself drinking twice as much coffee here as I did in New York. For me, the climate here is debilitating. Perhaps because of the dampness and the very low altitude. Really, there's no altitude at all. It's slightly under sea level. Have another cup with me? The writer doesn't answer. Jane prepares 2 more cups of the instant coffee. Ty is staring steadily, challengingly at the writer, who appears to be hypnotized. Of course, Manhattan hasn't much altitude either, but I grew up in the Adirondacks, really. We lived on high ground, good elevation. Ty, I met one of them once by accident on the street. You see? I was out of a job and he came up to me on a corner in the quarter and invited me to his place for supper with him. I seen right off what he was and what he wanted, but I didn't have the price of a poor boy sandwich, so I accepted. I went. The place was all Japanese-like, everything very artistic. He said to me, "Cross over that little bridge that crosses my little lake, which I made myself, and sit on the bench under my willow tree, while I make supper for us and bathe and change my clothes. I won't be long." So I crossed over the bridge, over the lake, and I stretched out under the weeping willow tree. Fell right asleep. I was woke up by what looked like a female, but was him in drag. "Supper ready," she said. Then this freak put her hand on I said, "It's going to cost you more than supper." Jane. Ty. Huh, baby? Jane. You will not continue that story. Ty. It's a damn good story. What's your objection to it? I ain't got to the part that's really funny. He speaks to the writer, who is crossing out of the light. Don't you like the story? The writer exits. Jane. Why did you do that? Ty. Do what? Jane. You know what. And the boy knew what you meant by it. Why did you want to hurt him with the implication that he was in a class with a predatory transvestite? Ty. Look, Jane. You say he was brought up on high ground, good elevation, but you come in here, you bring in here and expose me to a little queer and... Jane. Does everyone with civilized behavior manners seem to be a queer to you? Ty. Was it good manners the way he looked at me, babe? Jane, voice rising. Was it good manners for you to stand in front of him rubbing your groin the way you did? Ty. I wanted you to notice his reaction. Jane. He was just embarrassed. Ty. You got a lot to learn about life in the quarter. Jane. I think that he's a serious person that I can talk to, and I need someone to talk to. Pause. Ty. You can't talk to me, huh? Jane. With you working all night at a Bourbon Street strip joint and sleeping nearly all day, involving yourself with all the underworld elements of this corrupt city? Ty. Is that all I do? Just that? I never pleasure you, babe? Fade in piano blues. She draws a breath and moves as if half asleep behind Ty's chair. Jane. Yes? You pleasure me, Ty. Ty. I tried to do my best to, babe. Sometimes I wonder why a girl. Jane. Not a girl, Ty. A woman. Ty. Why did you get yourself mixed up with me? Jane. A sudden change of circumstances removed me from... How shall I put it so you'd understand? Ty. Just say. Jane. What I thought was myself. So I quit my former connections. I came down here to... She stopped short. Well, to make an adjustment to... Pause. We met by chance on Royal Street when a deluge of rain backed me into a doorway. Didn't you know you were behind me until you put your hand on my hip and I turned to say, "Stop that!" But didn't, because you were something I'd never encountered before. Faintly innocent. Boy's eyes, smiling. Said to myself, why not, with nothing to lose? Of course you pleasure me, Ty. I'd been alone so long. She touches his throat with trembling fingers. He leans sensually back against her. She runs her hand down his chest. Silk on silk is lovely, regardless of the danger. As the light on this area dims, typing begins offstage. The dim out is completed. Scene 4. A lighted area represents Mrs. Wire's kitchen, in which she is preparing a big pot of gumbo despite the hour, which is midnight. She could be mistaken for a witch from Macbeth in a vaguely modern but not new costume. The writer's footsteps catch her attention. He appears at the edge of the light in all that remains of his wardrobe, riding boots and breeches, a faded red flannel shirt. Mrs. Wire. Who? Who? Aw, you dressed up like a jockey in a donkey race. Writer. My clothes are at the cleaners. Mrs. Wire. Do they clean clothes at the pawn shop? Yeah, I reckon they do clean clothes, not redeemed. Oh, don't go upstairs, your room is forfeited too. Writer. You mean Mrs. Wire. A loser, boy. Possibly you could get a cot at the Salvation Army. Writer, averting his eyes. May I sit down a moment? Mrs. Wire. Why? For what? Writer. Eviction presents a problem. Mrs. Wire. I thought you was getting on the WPA Writers' project. That's what you told me when I inquired about your prospects for employment. You said, oh, I've applied for work on the WPA for writers. Writer. I couldn't prove that my father was destitute, and the fact that he contributes nothing to my support seemed immaterial to them. Mrs. Wire. Why are you shifty-eyed? I never seen a more shifty-eyed boy. Writer. I have had a little eye trouble lately. Mrs. Wire. You're getting a cataract on your left eye, boy. Face it, cataracts don't usually hit at your age. Writer. I've noticed a lot of things have hit me prematurely. Mrs. Wire, stirring gumbo. Hungry? I bet. I eat at irregular hours. I suddenly got a notion to cook up a gumbo, and when I do, the smell of it is an attraction. Draws company in the kitchen. Oh-ho! Footsteps fast. Here comes the ladies. Writer. Mrs. Wire, those old ladies are starving, dying of malnutrition. Miss Carrie and Mary Maud appear at the edge of the lighted area with queer, high-pitched laughter or some bizarre relation to laughter. Mrs. Wire. Sit back down there, boy. Pause. Why, Miss Wayne and Miss Carrie, you girls still up at this hour? Miss Carrie. We heard you moving about and wondered if we could, Mary Maud, be of some assistance. Mrs. Wire. Shoot, Mrs. Wayne, do you imagine that rusty old saucepan of yours is invisible to me? Why, I know when I put this gumbo on the stove and lit the fire, it would smoke you ladies out of your locked room. What do you all do in that locked room so much? Mary Maud. Keep ourselves occupied. Miss Carrie. We are compiling a cookbook which we hope to have published. A Creole cookbook. Recipes we remember from our childhood. Mrs. Wire. A recipe is a poor substitute for food. Mary Maud, with a slightly breathless pause. We ought to go out more regularly for meals, but our light bulbs have burned out, so we can't distinguish night from day anymore. Only shadows come in. Miss Carrie, shh. Pause. You know, I turned down an invitation to dinner this evening at my cousin Matilda Devereux Pappett's in the Garden District. Mrs. Wire. Objected to the menu? Miss Carrie. No, but, very rich people are so inconsiderate sometimes. With 4 limousines and drivers at their constant disposal, they wouldn't send one to fetch me. Mrs. Wire. 4 limousines? 4 drivers? A delicate Evanescent music steals in as the scene acquires a touch of the bizarre. At moments, the players seem bewildered as if caught in a dream. Miss Carey. Oh, yes, four spanking new Cadillacs with uniformed chauffeurs. Mrs. Wire. Now, that's very impressive, Miss Carey. They call Mr. Pathay the Southern Planter, Mrs. Wire. Has a plantation in the Garden District? Miss Carey gasping. Oh, no, 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 no. He's a mortician. Most prominent mortician. All the best families in the parish. Mrs. Wire. And poor relations, too, I hope? Mary Maud. Miss Carey goes into a family vault when she goes. Mrs. Wire. When? Mary Maud. Yes, above ground. Has a vault reserved in Miss Carey. Let's not speak of that now. Mrs. Wire. Why not speak of that? You got to consider the advantage of this connection because of the expenses of the inevitable someday soon, especially with your asthma, no light, and bad nutrition. Miss Carey. The dampness of the old walls in the quarter. You know how they hold damp. This city is actually 8 feet below sea level. Blacks are buried underground and their caskets fill immediately with water. Mrs. Wire. But I reckon your family vault is above the black water level? Miss Carey. Oh, yes, above water level. In fact, I'll be on top of my great-great-uncle Jean-Pierre Devereux III. The writer laughs a bit involuntarily. The ladies glare at him. Mrs. Wire, who is this transient young man? Mary Maud. We did understand that this was a guest house, not a refuge for delinquents. Miss Carey, turning her back on the writer. They do set an exquisite table at the Pathays with excellent food, but it's not appetizing, you know, to be conducted on a tour of inspection of the business display room. You know, the latest model of caskets on display, and that's what René Pathay does. Invariably escorts me, proud as a peacock, through the coffin display rooms before we sit down to dinner. And all through dinner he discusses his latest clients and those expected shortly. Mrs. Wire. Maybe he wants you to pick out your casket because he's noticed your asthma from damp walls in the quarter. Miss Carey. I do, of course, understand that business is business with him, a night and day occupation. Mrs. Wire. You know, I always spit in a pot of gumbo to give it a special flavor, like a bootblack spits on a shoe. She pretends to spit in the pot. The crones try to laugh. Now, help yourself. Fill your saucepan full and I'll loan you a couple of spoons, but let it cool a while. Don't blister your gums. Handing them spoons. And, Mrs. Wayne, I'll be watching the mailbox for Buster's Army paycheck. Mary Maud. That boy has never let me down. He's the most devoted son a mother could hope for. Mrs. Wire. Yes, if she had no hope. Mary Maud. I got a postcard from him. Mrs. Wire. A postcard can't be cashed. Mary Maud, diverting Mrs. Wire's attention, she hopes, as Miss Carey ladles out gumbo. Of course, I wasn't prepared for the circumstance that struck me when I discovered that Mr. Wayne had not kept up his insurance payments. That I was not prepared for, that it was lapsed. Mrs. Wire, amused. I bet she wasn't prepared for a little surprise like that. Mary Maud. No, not for that, nor for the discovery that secretly for years he'd been providing cash and real estate to that little red-headed doxy he'd kept in Bay St. Louis. Miss Carey. Ow! Mrs. Wire whirls about, and Miss Carey is forced to swallow the scalding mouthful. Mrs. Wire. I bet that mouthful scorched her throat, Miss Carey. Didn't I tell you to wait? Mary Maud. Carey, give me that saucepan before you spill it. Your hand's so shaky. Thank you, Mrs. Wire. Carey, thank Mrs. Wire for her being so concerned always about our circumstances here. Now let's go and see what can be done for that throat. They move toward the stairs but do not exit. Mrs. Wire. Cut it, if all else fails. Something crashes on the stairs. All turn that way. Tai appears dimly, bearing two heavy cartons. He speaks to the writer who is nearest to him. Tai. Hey you, boy. Writer. Me? Tai. Yeah. Yeah, you. I dropped one of these packages on the steps so goddamn dark I dropped it. And I'd appreciate it if you'd pick it up for me and help me get it upstairs. Writer. I'll be glad to try to. Tai focuses dimly on Miss Carey. He blinks several times in disbelief. Tai. Am I in the right place? Mrs. Wire shouting. Not in your present condition. Go on back out. Sleep it off in the gutter. Miss Carey to Mrs. Wire. Tragic for such a nice-looking young man to return to his wife in that condition at night. Mrs. Wire. Practically every night. Miss Carey and Mary Maud exit. Tai has almost miraculously managed to collect his dropped packages, and he staggers to stage right where the lower steps to the attic are dimly seen. The writer follows. Tai, stumbling back against the writer. Can you make it? Can you make it, kid? They slowly mount the steps. The lighted kitchen is dimmed out. There is a brief pause. A soft light is cast on the attic hall. Tai. Now, kid, can you locate my room key in my pocket? Writer. Which pocket? Tai. Pan's pocket. Writer. Left pocket or Tai? Head spinning, money in hip pocket. Key in right. Left side. Shit. Key before I fall. The writer's hand starts to enter a pocket when Tai collapses, spilling the boxes on the floor and sprawling across them. Writer. You're right outside my cubby hole. I suggest you rest in there before you wake up your wife. Tai. My old lady, she'd chews my ass off if I come home this ways. He struggles heroically to near standing position as the writer guides him into his cubicle. This bed? There is a soft, ghostly laugh from the adjoining cubicle. A match strikes briefly. Writer, swing your legs other way. That way's the pillow. Would you, like your wet shoes off? Tai. Shoes? Yes, but nothing else. Once I passed out on Bourbon Street late night in a dark doorway. Woke up, this guy was taking liberties with me, and I don't go for that stuff. Writer, I don't take advantages of that kind. I'm going back downstairs if you're comfortable now. Tai. I said to this guy, okay, if you want to blow me, you can pay me $100. Before, not after. Tai's voice dies out. Nightingale becomes visible, rising stealthily in his cubicle and slipping on a robe as Tai begins to snore. The attic lights dim out. The lights on the kitchen come up as the writer re-enters. Mrs. Wire. Got that bum to bed? Sit down, son. Ha! Notice I called you son. Where do you go nights? Writer. Oh, I walk. I take long solitary walks. Sometimes I... Mrs. Wire. Sometimes you what? You can say it's none of my business, but I have a sort of you could say I have a sort of a material concern. You see, I do have a son that I never see no more, but I worry about him. So, I reckon it's natural for me to worry about you a little. And get things straight in my head about you. You've changed since you've been in this house, you know that? Writer. Yes, I know that. Mrs. Wire. This I'll tell you. When you first come to my door, I swear I seen and I recognized a young gentleman in you. Shy. Shaky, but... Writer. Panicky. Yes. Gentleman? My folks say so. I wonder. The light narrows and focuses on the writer alone. The speech becomes an interior reflection. I've noticed I do have some troublesome little scruples in my nature that may cause difficulties in my... He rises and rests his foot on the chair. Negotiated a truce with my life. Oh, there's a price for things. That's something I've learned in the Vieux Carre. For everything that you purchase in this marketplace, you pay out of here. He thumps his chest. And the cash, which is the stuff you use in your work, can be overdrawn, depleted, like a reservoir going dry in a long season of drought. The scene is resumed on a realistic level with a change in the lighting. Mrs. Wire passing a bowl of gumbo to the writer. Here, son, have some gumbo. Let it cool a while. I just pretended to spit in it, you know. Writer. I know. Mrs. Wire. I make the best gumbo. I do the best Creole cooking in Louisiana. It's God's truth, and now I'll tell you what I'm planning to do while your gumbo's cooling. I'll tell you because it involves a way you could pay your room and board here. Writer. Oh? Mrs. Wire. Uh-huh. I'm planning to open a lunchroom. Writer. On the premises here? Mrs. Wire. On the premises, in my bedroom, which I'm going to convert into a small dining room. So I'm going to get printed up some business cards. And 12 noon every day, except Sundays, you can hit the streets with these little business cards announcing that lunch is being served for 25 cents. A cheaper lunch than you could get in a greasy spoon on Chartres. And no better cooking in the Garden District or the Vieux Carre. Writers. Meals for a quarter in the quarter. Mrs. Ware. Hey! That's the slogan. I'll print it on those cards that you'll pass out. Writer dreamily. Wonderful gumbo. Mrs. Wire. Why, this meal's a quarter in the quarter. Is going to put me back in the black. Yeah, boy. She throws him the key to his attic rooms. The lights dim out briefly. Ty's voice. Hey, what you doing? Get your fucking hands off me. The writer appears dimly in the attic hall outside his room. He stops. Nightingale's voice. I thought that I was visiting a friend. Ty's voice. Is that how you visit a friend? Unzipping his pants and pulling out his dick? Nightingale's voice. I assure you it was a mistake of identity. Ty, becoming visible on the side of the bed in the writer's cubicle. This ain't my room. Where's my old lady? Hey, Jane. Writer. You collapsed in the hall outside your door, so I helped you in here. Ty. Both of you get this straight. No goddamn faggot messes with me. Never. For less than $100. Jane becomes visible in the hall before this line. $100. Yes, maybe, but not a dime less. Nightingale emerging from the cubicle in his robe. I'm afraid that you have priced yourself out of the market. Jane. Ty, come out of there. Ty. I've been interfered with because you'd locked me out. Writer. Miss Sparks, I didn't touch your friend except to offer him my bed till you let him in. Jane. Ty, stand up if you can stand. Stand. Walk. Ty stumbles against her, and she cries out as she is pushed against the wall. Ty's voice. Locked out. Bolted out of my room to be molested. Jane. I heard you name a price. With you, everything has a price. Thanks. Good night. During this exchange, Nightingale in his purple robe has leaned, smoking with a somewhat sardonic look, against the partition between the two cubicles. The writer reappears. Nightingale. Back so quick? Tant pis. Writer. I think if I were you, I'd go in your room and get to bed. The writer enters his cubicle. Nightingale's face slowly turns to a mask of sorrow past expression. There is music. Nightingale puts out his cigarette and enters his cubicle. Jane undresses Ty. The writer undresses. Nightingale sits on his cot. Ty and Jane begin to make love. Downstairs, Nursey mops the floor, singing to herself. The writer moves slowly to his bed and places his hand on the warm sheets that Ty has left. The light dims. There is a passage of time. Scene 5. The attic rooms are dimly lit. Nightingale is adjusting a neckerchief above his wasted throat. He enters the writer's cubicle without knocking. Nightingale. May I introduce once more? It's embarrassing, this incident. Not of any importance, nothing worth a second thought. He coughs. Oh, Christ. You know, my mattress is full of bed bugs. Last night I smashed one at least the size of my thumbnail. It left a big blood spot on the pillow. He coughs and gasps for breath. I showed it to the colored woman that the witch calls Nursey, and Nursey told her about it, and she came charging up here and demanded that I exhibit the bug, which I naturally... A note of uncertainty and fear enters his voice. Writer, removed from the pillow. Nightingale. Who in the hell wouldn't remove the remnants of a squashed bed bug from his pillow? Nobody I'd want social or any acquaintance with. She even intimated that I coughed out the blood as if I had coughs. Consumption. Writer, stripped to his shorts and about to go to bed. I think with that persistent cough of yours, you should get more rest. Nightingale. Restlessness. Insomnia. I can't imagine a worse affliction, and I've suffered from it nearly all my life. I consulted a doctor about it once, and he said, you don't sleep because it reminds you of death. A ludicrous assumption. The only true regret I'd have over leaving this world is that I'd leave so much of my serious work unfinished. Writer, holding the bed sheet up to his chin. Do show me your serious work. Nightingale. I know why you're taking this tone. Writer. I'm not taking any tone. Nightingale. Oh, yes, you are. You're very annoyed with me because my restlessness, my loneliness made me so indiscreet as to offer my attentions to that stupid but physically appealing young man you'd put on that cot with the idea of reserving him for yourself. And so I do think your tone is a bit hypocritical, don't you? Writer. All right. I do admit I find him attractive too, but I did not make a pass at him. Nightingale. I heard him warn you. Writer. I simply removed his wet shoes. Nightingale. Little man, you are sensual, but I am rapacious. Writer. And I am tired. Nightingale. Too tired to return my visits? Not very appreciative of you. But lack of appreciation is something I've come to expect, and almost to accept, as if God, the alleged, had stamped on me a sign at birth. This man will offer himself and not be accepted, not by anyone ever. Writer. Please don't light that candle. Nightingale. I shall. The candle is lit. Writer. I do wish that you returned to your side of the wall. Well, now I am taking a tone, but it's justified. Now, do please get out. Get out. I mean it. When I blow out the candle, I want to be alone. Nightingale. You know, you're going to grow into a selfish, callous man, returning no visits, reciprocating no caring. Writer. Why do you predict that? Nightingale. That little opacity on your left eye pupil could mean a like thing happening to your heart. He sits on the cot. Writer. You have to protect your heart. Nightingale. With a shell of calcium? Would that improve your work? Writer. You talk like you have a fever. Nightingale. I have a fever you'd be lucky to catch. A fever to hold and be held. He throws off his tattered silk robe. Hold me. Please, please hold me. Writer. I'm afraid I'm tired. I need to sleep and I don't want to catch your cold. Slowly with dignity, Nightingale rises from the cot and puts his silk robe on. Nightingale. And I don't want to catch yours, which is a cold in the heart. That's a hell of a lot more fatal to a boy with literary pretensions. This releases in the writer a cold rage, which he has never felt before. He springs up and glares at Nightingale, who is coughing. Writer, in a voice quick and hard as a knife. I think there has been some deterioration in your condition, and you ought to face it. A man has got to face everything sometime and call it by its true name, not try to escape it by cowardly evasion. Go have your lungs x-rayed and don't receive the doctor's bill when it's sent. But go there quick. Have the disease stated clearly. Don't call it a cold anymore or a touch of the flu. Nightingale, turning with a gasp. You've gone mad. You've gone out of your mind here, you little one-eyed bitch. He coughs again and staggers out of the light. Mrs. Wire's voice. I heard you from the kitchen, boy. Was he molesting you in there? I heard him. Was he molesting you in there? Speak up. You watch out, I'll get the goods on you yet. Nightingale's voice. The persecution continues. Scene 6. Daylight appears in the alcove window. Daylight tinged with rain. The room of Jane and Ty is lighted. Ty is sprawled, apparently sleeping, in shorts on the studio bed. Jane has just completed a fashion design. She stares at it with disgust, then crumples it and throws it to the floor with a sob of frustration. Jane. Yes? Who's there? Writer. Me, from across the hall. I brought in a letter for you. It was getting rained on. Jane. Oh, one moment, please. She throws a robe over her panties and bra and opens the door. A letter for me? Writer. The mail gets wet when it rains since the lids come off the mailbox. His look irresistibly takes in the figure of Ty. Jane tears the letter open and gasps softly. She looks slowly up with a stunned expression at the young writer. Jane. Would you care for some coffee? Writer. No. Thanks. No, I just take it in the morning. Jane. Then please have a drink with me. I need a drink. Please come in. Jane is speaking hysterically but abruptly controls it. Excuse me, would you pour the drinks? I can't. Writer crossing to the cabinet. Will you have, Jane, bourbon, 3 fingers. Writer. With? Jane. Nothing. The writer glances again at Ty as he pours the bourbon. Nothing. The writer crosses to her with a drink. Nothing. And you? Writer. Nothing, thanks. I have to retype the manuscripts soaked in the rain. Jane. Manuscripts, you said? Oh yes, you're a writer. I knew it just slipped my mind. The manuscripts were returned? Does that mean rejection? Rejection is always so painful. Writer with shy pride. This time, instead of a printed slip, there was this personal signed note. Jane. Encouraging, that. Oh, my glass is weeping. An Italian expression. Would you play barman again, please? She doesn't know where to put the letter, which he keeps glancing at. Writer. Yes, I am encouraged. He says, this one doesn't quite make it, but try us again. Story magazine. They print William Surion, do you know? Jane. It takes a good while to get established in a creative field. Writer. And meanwhile, you've got to survive. Jane. I was lucky, but the luck didn't hold. She is taking little sips of the straight bourbon. Writer. You're upset by that letter? I noticed it came from. Isn't it Oshner's a clinic? Jane. Yes, actually, I am. I was. It concerns a relative rather critically ill there. Writer. Someone close to you? Jane. Yes, quite close. Although lately I hardly recognize the lady at all anymore. Ty stirs on the bed. The writer irresistibly glances at him. Pull the sheet over him. I think he unconsciously displays himself like that, as if posing for a painter of sensual inclinations. Wasted on me, I just illustrate fashions for ladies. Ty, stirring. Beret? Beret? The writer starts off, pausing at the edge of the light. Writer. Jane, what was the letter? Wasn't it about you? Jane. Let's just say it was a sort of personal signed rejection slip, too. The writer exits with a backward glance. Ty. Where's Beret? Where's the goddamn cat? Jane is fiercely tearing the letter to bits. The light dims out. Scene 7. A dim light comes up on the writer, stage front as narrator. Writer. The basement of the building had been leased by Mrs. Wire to a fashionable youngish photographer, one T. Hamilton Biggs, a very effete man he was, who had somehow acquired a perfect Oxford accent in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He made a good living in New Orleans out of artfully lighted photos of debutantes and society matrons in the Garden District. But for his personal amusement, he also photographed, more realistically, some of the many young drifters to be found along the streets of Vieux Carre. The lights go up on the kitchen. Mrs. Wire is seen at the stove, which bears steaming pots of water. Mrs. Wire to the writer. Aw, it's you sneaking in at 2 a.m. like a thief. Writer. Yes, good night. Mrs. Wire. Hold on. Don't go up yet. He's at it again down there. He's throwing one of his orgies, and this'll be the last one he throws down there. By God and by Jesus, the society folk in this city may tolerate vice, but not me. Take one of them pots off the stove. Writer. You're, cooking at this hour? Mrs. Wire. Not cooking. I'm boiling water. I take this pot and you take the other one. We'll pour this water through the hole in this kitchen floor, which is directly over that studio of his. Writer. Mrs. Wire, I can't be involved in... Mrs. Wire. Boy, you're employed by me. You're fed and housed here, and you do like I tell you, or you'll go on the street. She lifts the great kettle off the stove. Take that pot off the stove. She empties the steaming water on the floor. Almost instant screams are heard below. Ha! Down there, what's the disturbance over? Writer. Mrs. Wire, that man has taken out a peace warrant against you. You know that. Mrs. Wire. Get out of my way, you shifty-eyed little... With demoniacal energy, she seizes the other pot and empties it onto the floor, and the screams continue. She looks and runs to the proscenium as if peering out a window. Two of them run out naked. Got two of you. I'm not down with you yet, you perverts. Writer. Mrs. Wire, he'll call the police. Mrs. Wire. Let him. Just let him. My nephew is a lieutenant on the police force. But these quarter police, why, anybody can buy him, and that Biggs, he's got big money. Best we be quiet. Sit tight. Act real casual like. If they get in that door, you seen him. Writer. What? Mrs. Wire. A drunk spilling water in here. Writer. That much water? Mrs. Wire. Hush up. One contradictory word out of you and I'll brain you with this saucepan here. Nightingale enters in his robe. Nightingale. May I inquire what this bedlam is about? He pants for breath. I just finally managed to... He gasps. This hellish disturbance. Mrs. Wire. May you inquire? Yeah, you may inquire. Look, here's the story. You're in a doped-up condition. Drunk and doped up, you staggered against the stove and accidentally knocked a kettle of boiling water off it. Now that's the story you'll tell in payment of back rent and your habits disgracing my house. Nightingale to writer. What is she talking about? Mrs. Wire. And you, One Eye. She turns to the writer. You say you witnessed it. You backed up the story, you hear? Writer, grinning. Mrs. Wire, the story wouldn't hold water. Mrs. Wire. I said accidental. In his condition, who'd doubt it? Nightingale. Who? Mrs. Wire. That night court buzzard on the bench. He'd throw the book at me for no reason but the fight that I've put up against the corruption and evil that this quarter is built on. All I'm asking is... Abruptly, Miss Carrie and Mary Maud in outrageous negligees burst into the kitchen. At the sight of them, Mrs. Wire starts to scream wordlessly as a peacock at a pitch that stuns the writer, but not Nightingale and the crones. Just as abruptly, she falls silent and flops into a chair. Miss Carrie. Oh, Mrs. Wire. Mary Maud. We thought the house had caught fire. Nightingale loftily. What a remarkable tableau vivant. The paddy wagon's approaching. Means night court, you know. Writer. I think I'll go to bed now. Mrs. Wire. Like shoot you will? Jane appears, stage right, in a robe. She speaks to the writer who is nearest to her. Jane, can you tell me what is going on down there? Writer. Miss Sparks, why don't you stay in your room right now? Jane. Why? Writer. There's been a terrible incident down here. I think the police are coming. Mary Maud screams, wringing her hands. Mary Maud. Police! Miss Carrie. Oh, Mary Maud, this is not the time for hysterics. You're not involved, nor am I. We simply came in to see what the disturbance was about. Jane, to the writer. Was Ty here? Was Ty involved in this? Writer, in a low voice to Jane. Nobody was involved but Mrs. Wire. She poured boiling water through a hole in the floor. Mrs. Wire, like a field marshal. Everybody in here, stay here and sit tight till the facts are reported. Nursey enters with black majesty. She is humming a church hymn softly. He walks with me and he talks with me. She remains at the edge of the action, calm as if unaware. I met every goddamn one of you except Nursey. Nursey, don't stand there singing gospel barefoot in that old dirty nightgown. Writer to Jane. She wants us to support a totally false story. Mrs. Wire. I tell you, the Vieux Carre is the new Babylon destroyed by evil and scriptures. Jane. It's like a dream. Nightingale. The photographer downstairs belongs to the Chateau family, one of the finest and most important families in the Garden District. Mrs. Wire. Oh, do you write the social register now? Nightingale. I know he is New Orleans' most prominent society photographer. Mrs. Wire. I know he's the city's most notorious pervert and is occupying space in my building. Miss Carrie. Mary Maud and I can't afford the notoriety of a thing like this. Mary Maud cries out and leans against the table. Mary Maud. Mrs. Wire, Miss Carrie and I have positions to maintain. Jane. Mrs. Wire, surely there's no need for these ladies to be involved in this. Mrs. Wire. Deadbeats. All. Will stay right here and... Jane. Do what? Mrs. Wire. Testify to what happened. Nightingale. She wishes you all to corroborate her lie. That I, oh yes, I'm appointed to assume responsibility for. Photographer offstage. Right up there. Burns like this could disfigure me for life. Mrs. Wire rushes to slam and bolt the door. Miss Carrie to Mary Maud. Honey, can you move now? Mrs. Wire. No, she can't. She stays, which applies to you all. Photographer. The fact that she is insane and allowed to remain at large doesn't excuse it. A patrolman bangs on the door. Mrs. Wire, shh! Nobody make a sound. Photographer, not only she, but her tenants. Why, the place is a psycho ward. More banging is heard. Mrs. Wire, what's this banging about? Patrolman, open this door. Photographer, one of my guests was the nephew of the district attorney. Patrolman, open or I'll force it. Photographer, break it in. Kick it open. Mrs. Wire galvanized. You ain't coming in here. You got no warrant to enter, you filthy morphodite, you. Writer, Mrs. Wire, you said not to make a sound. Mrs. Wire, make no sound when they're breaking in my one-eyed Jack. The banging continues. What's the meaning of this, waking me up at 2 a.m. in the morning? Photographer, scalded. 5 guests, including 2 art models. Mrs. Wire overlapping. You've broken the terms of your lease, and now it's broke. I rented you that downstairs space for legitimate business. You turned it into a continual orgy. Patrolman, open that door, ma'am. People have been seriously injured. Mrs. Wire, that's no concern of mine. I open no door till I phone my nephew, a lieutenant on the police force, Jim Flynn, who knows the situation I've been put up with here, and then we'll see who calls the law on who. Writer, I hear more police sirens coming. The pounding and shouting continue. A patrolman forces entry, followed by another. All during the bit just preceding, Miss Carrie and Mary Maud have clung together, their terrified whispers maintaining a low-pitched threadnody to the shouting and banging. Now as the 2 patrolmen enter, their hysteria erupts in shrill screams. The screams are so intense that the patrolman's attention is directed upon them. Patrolman 1. Christ, is this a fucking madhouse? Still clinging together, the emaciated crones sink to their knees as if at the feet of an implacable deity. Mrs. Wire, inspired. Officers, remove these demented old horrors. Why, you know what they done? Poured water on the floor of my kitchen, boiling water. Nightingale. She's lying. These unfortunate old ladies just came in. They thought the house was on fire. Photographer. This woman is the notorious Mrs. Wire, and it was she who screamed out the window. Why, these old women should be hospitalized. Naturally, but it's her. Her. He points at Mrs. Wire from the door, that poured the scalding water into my studio and screamed with delight when my art models and guests ran naked into the street. Mrs. Wire. There. Now. Orgy confessed. Patrolman 1. All out to the wagon. The scene is dimmed out fast. A spot comes up on the writer in the witness box at night court. Old judge's voice. Let's not have no more beating around the bush in this court, young fellow. The question is plain. You're under oath to give an honest answer. Now, for the last time, at risk of being held in contempt of court, did you or did you not see the proprietor of the rooming house? Mrs. Wire's voice shrilly. Restaurant and rooming house respectfully run. The judge pounds his gavel. Old judge's voice. Defendant will keep silent during the witness's testimony. To repeat the question, did you or did you not see this lady here pour boiling water through the floor of her kitchen down into the studio of Mr. T. Hamilton Biggs? Writer swallows, then in a low voice. I think it's unlikely a lady would do such a thing. Old judge's voice. Speak up so I can hear you. What's that you said? Writer. I said I thought it was very unlikely a lady would do such a thing. Laughter is heard in the night court. The judge gavels, then pronounces the verdict. Old judge's voice. This court finds the defendant, Mrs. Hortense Wire, guilty as charged and imposes a fine of $50 plus damages and releases her on probation in the custody of her nephew, Police Lieutenant James Flynn of New Orleans Parish, for a period of His voice fades out as he does the scene. A spotlight comes up on Mrs. Wire in a flannel robe and drinking at the kitchen table. The writer appears hesitantly at the edge of the kitchen light. Mrs. Wire without turning. I know you're standing there, but I don't want to see you. It sure does surprise me that you dare to enter this house again after double-crossing me in court tonight. Writer, I just came back to pick up my things. Mrs. Wire, you ain't gonna remove nothing from this place till you paid off what you owe me. Writer, you know I'm destitute. Mrs. Wire, you get tips from the customers. Writer, nickels and dimes. Pause. The sound of rain is heard. Mrs. Wire? She turns slowly to look at him. Do you think I really intended to lose you that case? Other witnesses had testified I was in the kitchen when you poured those kettles of water through the floor. And the judge knew I could see with at least one eye. I was on the witness stand under oath. Couldn't perjure myself. I did try not to answer directly. I didn't answer directly. All I said was, Mrs. Wire, you said what lost me the case, goddammit. Did you expect that old buzzard on the bench to mistake me for a lady, my hair in curlers, me wearing the late long ago Mr. Wire's old ragged bathrobe? Shoot, all of you witnesses betrayed me in night court because you live off me and can't forgive me for it. Writer, I guess you want me to go. Mrs. Wire, to where would you go? How far could you get on your nickels and dimes? You're shivering like a wet dog. Sit down. Have a drink with me before you go up to bed. Writer, you mean I can stay? She nods slightly. He sits down at the kitchen table. She pours him a drink. I don't think I ever saw you drink before, Mrs. Wire. Mrs. Wire, I only touched this bottle, which also belonged to the late Mr. Wire, before he descended to hell between two crooked lawyers. I touch it only when forced to by such a shocking experience as I had tonight. The discovery that I was completely alone in the world. A solitary old woman cared for by no one. You know, I heard some doctors say on the radio that people die of loneliness, especially at my age. They do. Die of it, it kills them. Well, that's not the cause that's put on the death warrant, but that's the true cause. I tell you, there's so much loneliness in this house that you can hear it. Sit still, and you can hear it. A sort of awful, soft groaning in all the walls. Writer, all I hear is rain on the roof. Mrs. Wire, you're still too young to hear it. But I hear it, and I feel it too, like a ache in every bone of my body. It makes me want to scream, but I gotta keep still. A landlady ain't permitted to scream. It would disturb the tenants. But sometime I will. I'll scream. I'll scream loud enough to bring the roof down on us all. Writer, this house is full of people? Mrs. Wire, people I let rooms to, less than strangers to me. Writer, there's me. I'm not. Mrs. Wire, you just endure my company because you're employed here, boy. Writer, Miss Sparks isn't employed here. Mrs. Wire, that woman is close to no one but the bum she keeps here. I'll show you. She rises and knocks her chair over, then bawls out as if to tie. More boxes. Take 'em out and stay out with them. Sleep it off on the streets. Jane rises in her dim spot of light. She crosses to the door. Jane, offstage. Ty. Ty, I thought I heard Ty down there. Mrs. Wire. Miss Sparks, don't you know that bum don't quit work till daybreak and rarely shows here before noon? Jane. Sorry. Excuse me. Writer. His speech is slurred by drink. God, but I was ignorant when I come here. This place has been on. How to pay you tuition. Mrs. Wire. One drink has made you drunk, boy. Go up to bed. We're going on tomorrow like nothing happened. He rises and crosses unsteadily from the kitchen light. Be careful on the steps. Writer. Pausing to look back at her. Good night, Mrs. Wire. He disappears. Mrs. Wire. It's true. People die of it. On the hall stairs, the writer meets Nightingale, who speaks before the writer enters his own cubicle. Nightingale, imitating the writer's testimony in Night Court. I think it's unlikely a lady would do such a thing. He coughs. A statement belonging in a glossary of deathless quotations. He coughs again. Completely convinced me you really do have a future in the literary profession. The light builds on Mrs. Wire, and she rises from the kitchen table and utters a piercing cry. Nursey appears. Nursey. Miss Wire, what on earth is it? A bat? Mrs. Wire. I just felt like screaming. And so I screamed. That's all. The lights dim out. Interval.